All significant human activities, sooner or later, are organized under a banner that represents those interested in and participating in that activity. Hunting is no different. Hi, I'm Shane Mahoney. We have labor and trade unions, associations of professionals, organizations, leagues, clubs, coalitions, societies, and fraternities for everything from farm bureaus to the United Nations. Today, the hunting and conservation landscape is populated with hundreds of clubs and organizations, some local and some national, each representing a common bond or purpose toward their individual areas of interest. That's a good thing. To the larger debate of what will be hunting's future, it is worth knowing how and why hunting clubs and conservation organizations formed in this country, and how a fragmented array of groups can and have become a strong voice for hunting, conservation, and our wildlife. The good news is sportsmen are now more organized than ever before. We'll explore our enhanced influence next on Boone and Crockett Country.
Boone and Crockett Country, presented by Leupold, America's Optics Authority.
Necessity is the mother of invention, is a saying that dates back to 16th century England. Simply put, it means that as a society we create things, not just randomly, but out of need. Our hunting society created many things out of necessity and is still inventing to this day. The first of such hunting inventions to arrive on the scene came in the early 1800s. While it's true, the tools we use for hunting keep evolving, of lasting significance are the groups that have formed around hunting to safeguard this tradition and our wildlife. There was a time in North America when hunting was purely an individual pursuit for the pot. That was about as organized as hunting was or needed to be. In time, as our population increased, the game found close to human encampments became scarce. Hunters needed to venture further out and further away from home to fill their bag. As encampments grew to towns and towns to cities, the neighboring woods and marshes became even less productive. Some concerned individuals began to ask why. This was long before there was any type of real understanding about natural systems and recruitment or wildlife sciences, game laws, or bag limits. At the time, wildlife was viewed as an inexhaustible resource. So there was no need for any type of order, management, or restraint. In fact, these principles were counter to the culture at the time that rejected anything that resembled old world European restrictions. The first organized effort of significance regarding hunting and wildlife was the formation of sportsmen's clubs, and the first known sportsmen's club was the Carroll Island Club, established in 1832. In the early 1800s, in and around the Chesapeake Bay region, the commercial shooting of waterfowl was a 6-day and night-a-week industry. The constant harassment by the market gunners made the region's waterfowl skittish and decoy shy. This did not sit well with the wealthy sportsman gunners of neighboring city centers like Baltimore, Washington, Philadelphia, and Annapolis. To carve out their own undisturbed hunting grounds, clubs formed and began buying up and posting choice shore areas covering the best passes along the waterfowl flight lanes. With the proliferation of such clubs, market gunners found it more profitable and less laborious to guide wealthy sportsmen than to bang out a living shooting ducks for market. In 1844, a group of 80 influential sportsmen formed the New York Sportsmen's Club. This was no social group, but an active band of militant conservationists ahead of their time. Their agenda was to take aim at 3 major targets: the ability to sell game for market, the spring shooting of game birds, and lax game laws in general.
The motivations for the first sportsmen's clubs were like those of many other interest groups that sprung up in early America. Fledgling hunting clubs realized that change was needed if their sporting way of life was to survive, and many were successful in effecting change in their local areas. The first national organization to arrive on the scene was the Boone and Crockett Club.
This was an association of sportsmen, primarily hunting riflemen, with an interest in and a concern for large mammal species that were being eliminated at an alarming rate. Theodore Roosevelt founded the club in 1887 as a coalition of sportsmen to spearhead an assault against the massive problems facing large mammals, public lands, and the forest resources of the nation.
Roosevelt and other members would invite experts to come and acquaint the membership with the problems of their concern, especially those relating to diminishment of wild lands and wildlife, and that would acquaint them with the scope and the causes of these problems. It would then invite politicians and other influential persons to club dinners and social activities where they too could be enlightened and persuaded to support the necessary legislation to bring about constructive change.
The Boone and Crockett Club may have been the first national organization of its kind working for hunting and wildlife, but there would be others.
Boone and Crockett Country is in partnership with the Wild Sheep Foundation, putting and keeping sheep on the mountain, and the Dallas Safari Club, promoting conservation and ethical hunting worldwide.
The formation of local sportsmen's clubs and then an organization like the Boone and Crockett Club taking on issues on a larger national scale was truly the beginning of the workhorses for conservation in North America. The Boone and Crockett Club and its members were able to accomplish many things to establish American conservation, but they had a few aces up their sleeve.
You have to understand, the political scene at the turn of the last century was far simpler than it is today. See a problem, get a few of the right friends to see the same problem, and fix it. Bureaucracies weren't as fully formed back then. It was easier to swing a big stick, and the Boone and Crockett Club had a big stick. Its president and founder would become the President of the United States.
With Roosevelt becoming the 26th president, conservation kicked into high gear. George Bird Grinnell, another of the club's founding members, first used the word conservation in his Forest and Stream magazine in 1884.
Roosevelt adopted the concept of conservation as a national issue for his administration by taking unprecedented action, speaking extensively, and using it as a theme for the White House Conference of Governors in 1908.
Roosevelt and Pinchot used this conference to draw states together with the federal government in developing and managing natural resources. Following the conference, Roosevelt created the National Conservation Commission to find cooperative methods to join natural resource management at state and federal levels.
Roosevelt's administration provided the catalyst and the momentum the nation needed to launch the conservation movement, gathering together fragmented parts into a unified philosophy and framework which we know today as American conservation. Roosevelt's brain trust and champions for conservation were primarily his fellow members in the Boone and Crockett Club.
At the same time, the conservation movement became even more organized and powerful with the formation of other organizations, many of which were either modeled after Boone and Crockett or were started by Boone and Crockett members. Working individually or in partnership with one another, the conservation organizations became not only a gathering place of like-minded sportsmen. These groups were able to move the needle for conservation. The conservation landscape was changing and gaining more traction. Laws were passed. Commercial market hunting shut down. Lands were set aside as nurseries for recovering wildlife populations. Funding for conservation was established. Year-round and then spring hunting was eliminated, leaving a fall hunting season with reasonable bag limits. The results? Sportsmen began working with conservation efforts instead of against them. They formed groups to make themselves even stronger, and wildlife recovered. During the period from 1940 to 1980, wildlife rebounded despite a world war and as the economy recovered from the Great Depression. During the war years, conservation efforts slowed, partly because of the distraction of war and because early conservation efforts were paying dividends, so the alarm was not quite as loud. The returning flood of GIs from World War II marked a significant surge in reconnecting with the outdoors through hunting and fishing. it also ignited the next wave of conservation activity. Wildlife recovery was now no longer a necessity. The new challenge was sustainability, not losing what we had gained. New pressures were being brought to bear on wildlife and their habitats. The battleground, as it was in the past, would again be on Capitol Hill. By the late 1960s, wildlife conservation and management programs aimed at wildlife recovery were no longer the priority. After all, those programs had been hugely successful, and wildlife for the most part was abundant again, for the first time in over half a century. The challenge for wildlife then became sustainability and not losing the ground we had gained. Certainly new pressures were being brought to bear on wildlife and their habitats, and this period saw the rise of many new conservation groups working on behalf of individual species. The battleground, as it was in the past, would be on Capitol Hill and with new conservation policies. Once again, conservation organizations would play a critical role in shaping these new policies, safeguarding our wildlife resource and our cherished traditions of hunting and angling. At the time, more conservation organizations were established. By the year 2000, the total number of conservation and hunting industry-related groups had grown to 45. By focusing on species and other specific missions, the many sportsman organizations together covered a vast set of issues. The strength in having many organizations with specific missions is even more powerful when those many groups can combine efforts on the issues common to all in a unified vision of American conservation.
Boone and Crockett Country is in partnership with the Pope and Young Club for the good of bow hunting and the Guide Outfitter Association of British Columbia. Wildlife stewardship is our priority.
Hunting is, for the most part, a solitary activity. We may share a camp with family and friends, but hunting is a very personal experience that is often done alone. That's the nature of it. Just as too many people with you in the field can spook your game, the opposite is true when protecting our rights to hunt and the systems of conservation that provide for the game we hunt. In these situations, the collective voice of many is not only effective. In today's world, it is mandatory.
A voice without an ear to listen to is like having no voice at all. So being organized amongst ourselves was good, but it would be better if we could know for sure that the federal authorities were seriously considering our views.
And now, a closer look with Doug Painter, presented by Leupold, America's Optics Authority.
A dozen years ago, the Boone and Crockett Club hosted a summit meeting at its Missoula, Montana headquarters that brought together conservation groups from around the country. The goal of this meeting was to bring greater unity to the conservation community to strengthen its ability to meet the challenges ahead. A key outcome of this landmark event was the formation of a new network of organizations, the American Wildlife Conservation Partners. Through this new organization, member groups now could exchange information and ideas on important issues, helping all involved to better accomplish common goals. From this exchange, a common agenda of long-running issues emerged, and AWCP published this list of issues in a document called Wildlife for the 21st Century, W21 for short. They submitted this to the incoming Bush administration in 2001. W21 Volumes 2 and 3 were submitted respectively to the Bush administration for the second term and then to the incoming Obama administration. An important accomplishment indeed, but much more needs to be done in the conservation arena, and all sportsmen need to pitch in. Sure, buying a hunting and fishing license helps fund conservation, but it's just a first step. If you're not already a member, I encourage you to join and actively support the Wildlife Conservation Organization or organizations of your choice.
During the George W. Bush administration, the American Wildlife Conservation Partners advocated for formal recognition of sportsman conservation. Using the Federal Advisory Committee Act, AWCP groups established the Sporting Conservation Council, later to be renamed the Wildlife and Hunting Heritage Conservation Council. The Council Charter authorizes it to hold public meetings with the U.S. Departments of Agriculture and the Interior to examine issues and submit recommendations.
It's a huge advantage for getting consideration of our community's views to be involved before and during the formal federal decision-making process. Being able to advise the government directly is about as high up on the ladder as our community has ever been.
Also during the Bush administration, the Sporting Conservation Council and AWCP groups obtained Executive Order 13443, the facilitation of hunting heritage and wildlife conservation. This order directed federal agencies to help expand and enhance hunting opportunities and the management of game species and their habitat. It also directed the White House Council on Environmental Quality to hold a policy conference and produce a 10-year agenda of federal activities. This conference took place in 2008, the 100th anniversary of Roosevelt's Conference of the Governors of the United States, at which President Roosevelt delivered the opening address, Conservation as a National Duty.
Boone and Crockett Country has been brought to you by Leupold, America's Optics Authority, and the Boone and Crockett Club, fair chase and conservation since 1887.
Wildlife policies and programs that do not carry forward from one presidential administration to another can be crippling. Our influence is needed here as well.
As the Bush administration developed a 10-year conservation agenda at the end of its time in office, there had to be a way to carry forward this work to a new incoming administration. Critical conservation projects and programs can take time to bear fruit. Stopping and starting every 4 years had been crippling and certainly doesn't do our wildlife any good.
Through careful efforts to define sportsmen's issues across political affiliations, sportsmen involved in this effort through the Council, AWCP, positions in government, and on the Obama transition team ensured that conservation programs and projects will have the time to bear fruit. Shortly after the Obama administration took office, it renewed the charter of the Council, with charge number 1 being to implement the 10-year agenda.
This was the critical kind of transition that conservation needed and never had in the past. We used to watch good programs die on the vine, but not anymore.
The Great Recession that coincided with the transition to a new president made worse the primary obstacle that sportsmen identified in the 10-year agenda: funding. Strength in numbers has always been the way to get things done on Capitol Hill. Just as the conservation community massed its own strength starting in 2000, in 2011 we joined with other interest groups. The result was the American Voice for Conservation, Recreation, and Preservation.
America's Voice for Conservation, Recreation, and Preservation is a bipartisan coalition of more than 1,000 organizations that represent tens of millions of Americans who enjoy conservation, outdoor recreation, and cultural and historic preservation. These organizations exist because of the natural and historic resources of our nation.
Formed in reaction to the 2011 budget and in anticipation of the 2012 budget, this coalition has compiled information on the economic and employment impact associated with conservation, outdoor recreation, and historic preservation. Those of us who care about conservation contribute more than $1.06 trillion to the economy. We support 9.4 million jobs. These activities contribute $107 billion in federal and state income taxes each year. As sportsmen, we spend a lot of time thinking about and preparing for the upcoming hunting seasons. That's part of the attraction and enjoyment we get out of hunting, looking forward to building new memories of days of field. What we hope you have learned here today is how and why such hopes are still possible, and why there is still game to be found once you reach your destination. The reason we can hunt today, the reason game is plentiful, is because sportsmen throughout history have organized themselves and applied their passion and strength wherever and whenever necessary to safeguard this priceless natural resource. This did not happen by accident. It took purpose, determination, and pride. The challenge our wildlife and their habitats, and therefore the traditions of hunting and angling face today, are real, and they are growing. They too will take purpose to resolve. The good news is we, as a hunting and conservation community, are as united and organized as we have ever been. Our voice can and must be heard. Thanks for joining us. I'm Shane Mahoney.